Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the show, Science Dispatch Podcast, episode 31. I am your host, Cameron English, joined, as I usually am, by Dr. Chuck Dinnerstein, Director of Medicine at the American Council on Science and Health. Chuck, how are you today?
I'm great. It's a beautiful day in the neighborhood.
Well, there you go. Mr. Rogers reference and everything. We're also joined by one of our favorite guests. She's a contributor to our site. Her name is Barbara Billauer, legal scholar and expert on bioethics. So she basically tackles all the questions everyone else is afraid to talk about. So I always find her work very, very interesting. And today we're talking about two stories that she published for ACSH, and they're both about Everett Koop, former Surgeon General through most of the 1980s, I believe. Barbara, is that right?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So I just want to dive right in here because these are really, really interesting articles. And I guess maybe the theme of both of these really is that you have an individual who's a bona fide physician. He's a very, very credible expert, but he also has deeply held religious views, and he wasn't shy about those, but he seemed to be able to balance them or at least separate them when he was coming to some of these controversial topics we're going to talk about. So why don't you give us just a brief overview? Why are you impressed by a man like this?
Thank you very much, Cameron. I've been thinking a lot about maybe the absence of leadership that we're seeing today, especially in the public health world and in the legal public health world, and trying to figure out how we're going to fix the system, because there's a lot of call to fix the system. Rachel Walensky at the CDC says, we're going to revamp the system. Well, there have been problems with CDC for decades, so I don't know what she's talking about, and how. And one of the things that I like doing is looking at case studies in the past for examples of people who have managed to cultivate the trust that everybody said is lacking from both sides of the aisle or from both sides of the platoon. And the image of Dr. Koop kept coming into my mind. And I didn't know as much. I didn't know that he had such deeply held religious views. I just have pictures of him in my mind on television and giving speeches about the dangers of tobacco and inspiring such confidence. I had no idea that there was this deep religious view that, in a sense, enabled him to be selected. In other words, he was selected on the basis of published writings that he was against abortion. And he gave one speech at the American Pediatric Society, I think, saying that abortion is one step away from infanticide and we're verging on Nazi Holocaust. And that's what endeared him to the Republicans that championed him for Surgeon General. And then, of course, he becomes Surgeon General, and he pretty much sticks it to them on the important issues. But what really fascinated me is what life experience he had. And here Chuck is going to be very valuable because that enabled him to flout the political position of the day. I mean, he basically stuck it to Reagan on abortion and on AIDS, and even on the tobacco issues. Senator Jesse Helms from North Carolina, the tobacco capital, was one of his champions that voted for him and supported his nomination. Now he's saying cigarettes are dangerous. So what got him to be able to have the strength of character, given his religious views, to be able to say, I'm not going to advocate for the public health based on my religion, but based on science? And so I was fascinated to look at his earlier life, which he started out as a surgeon, a pediatric surgeon, an expert pediatric surgeon. And maybe Chuck can give us some insights as what is it about the life of a pediatric or a surgeon or is there anything specific? There were some cases, of course, that Koop handled that I think helped develop this character trait. But is there anything general in the life of a surgeon? Yeah.
Surgeons have the reputation as doers. We got our hands in there mucking around, moving parts. But that really is only, that's the fun part. But there's a larger part that's involved with the judgment about who to operate on and when to operate upon them. And I think that a lot of what you like about C. Everett Koop comes from that kind of surgical training, the cognitive part, not so much the hands-on part. That and especially this is especially true for him because he was right there at the front edge of pediatric surgery and operating on these little teeny creatures, and to take that life into your hands requires a certain self-assurance, especially to take that life into your hands, as well as the lives and feelings of the parents, which is even greater than most surgeons have to deal with. And I think the fact that he was able to make those judgments and live with the results, bad or good, really set the stage for dealing with political decisions. I've said this before, and it may be self-serving, but once you've taken care of a person where there's a real life-death possibility, and in surgery, if you're wrong, you know about it right away. It's very tough to say, well, the disease did it, not you. That really changes your outlook towards looking at a lot of political decisions. It stiffens your spine, and I think that surgical background is what gave him that additional edge to face the politicians. Once you've had to face the mother of a newborn that's died despite the best care you can give them, Ronald Reagan and a few senators mean nothing.
That's fascinating. And I also, in his case, there were two cases or two series of cases that I think perhaps etched into his soul the exact issues that you're talking about. The first is a case of the conjoined twins that I mentioned. Two twins were born, baby A and baby B. Baby B had a 4-chamber heart. Baby A had a 2-chamber heart. And the question was, could they separate the twins, or should they separate the twins, knowing for a certainty that baby A would die and maybe baby B would live. And here, Cameron, this is a really good example of law and ethics and religion coming together. And actually, ethics does not play a role. The legal and the religious investigation actually tracked each other. It was fascinating. The parents were Orthodox Jews, and the question was submitted to the highest levels of Orthodox Jewish thinking, Moshe Feinstein, who was the leading arbiter of the day, and he relied on his son-in-law, Moses Tendler, who was a biologist. And I didn't know this, but Tendler's son, Feinstein's grandson, was a rabbi and also a physician. So these 3 or 4 rabbis are sitting mulling on these issues and asking the same questions and using the same analysis that the judge used, because Koop, while he was of the opinion that it was better to save one life, possibly, and he said to the nurses, there were several Catholic nurses, I could sit here and watch both babies die slowly, or I could watch one baby die quickly and maybe have a chance to save the other. That was the way he handled it. And it exemplified the integrity of his personality. He brought together both the religion and the doctor, the need to be moral and respect every life, and at the same time, the need to preserve every life. And he was able to weigh it, and I suppose it crystallized, and I was actually fascinating, though, that the questions that the judge asked, because Koop was afraid that he would be prosecuted for premeditated murder, because it was a certainty in this operation that baby A would die. It was an absolute certainty. And they used the word in the discussion, sacrifice. Can we sacrifice baby A for baby B? And the questions both the rabbis asked and the judge asked were the same. Can you legitimately, under certain circumstances, let one person die or even take steps to cause one person die if it might save the other. And the analogy that the rabbis used was two people jumping out of a plane and latching onto a parachute, and the judge used a similar analogy about two mountain climbers. It was almost identical. And they came out with the decision, yes, it was permitted, and Koop went ahead and operated. The parents, of course, were, he wasn't afraid of the parents suing him. He was afraid of the state of premeditated murder. Baby A died as was predicted. Baby B lived for, I think, 3 months. And this is the sad part. I found it afterwards in an obscure reference. The major references say baby B died of liver failure. Baby B died of liver failure because she got a blood transfusion and had hepatitis B as a result of the blood transfusion. And Chuck, am I correct that today, if the baby had been vaccinated, don't they give hepatitis B vaccines at birth? That
Yes.
wouldn't have happened. So I think that was the first internal, the angel battling his soul is, can I do this? And having the two sides of him, the religious side, the moral side, and then the scientific side battle each other, and feeling whole enough, being able to holistically integrate all aspects of his personality and come out and do the best he could. And then the second are the Baby Doe cases. And this is, people I don't think know this about Koop, but he was a proponent of disability, children born with congenital anomalies, doing whatever was necessary to save them. So in the first case, a baby was born with Down syndrome and esophageal atresia. And Chuck, I'll let you explain what that is.
So atresia really is an esophageal atresia means that the esophagus, the tube that goes from your mouth to your stomach, is underdeveloped and food cannot pass down from your mouth into your stomach, so you begin to starve. So the only way to correct that is to place a feeding tube into the stomach of the child.
Well, apparently Koop had done like 500 operations to repair this and had a 100% success rate or close to it. And the Baby Doe's obstetrician, the obstetrician of the mother, on learning that the child had Down syndrome, said, oh, even if the surgery worked and there's only a 50% chance, this baby will be severely retarded. And Koop said, well, first of all, you can get pretty successful surgical atresia repairs, and you can predict in advance how retarded a Down syndrome child is going to be. And the lawyers of the hospital went to court along with lawyers of parents who wanted to adopt this baby, and they lost because the court said you can't trade on the physician's judgment when the parents want to go and follow the physician's judgment. And about a year later, a similar case happened. In this case, the baby was born with spina bifida and hydrocephalus. And the same thing, there was a dispute amongst the physicians. Should they let the baby die? Should they not? By the time they started to figure out what they wanted to do, the child had a severe brain inflammation, leaving the child severely retarded. And by then it was too late to do anything. The child did survive for at least 30 years. That was the last I could find. But they could have done more to help the child get through the roughest parts of the baby's life, and the parents didn't want to do it. And I think that those cases stiffened Koop's resolve that even where there's a conflict, and we have to respect individual physicians' judgment, the clinician's judgment, there comes a point where the state has to step in. And this is, I found this quote, this is absolutely fascinating. And this is one of the things that drives me nuts about politics. So this is the Baby Doe case. And the liberals argued that the choice for or against treatment should be exercised by individuals, not the government. This is the liberals. The conservatives argued that they denounced government interference with medical practice, and they said that that shouldn't happen. And today we see the exact reverse. The exact reverse. I mean, DeSantis, it says that the parents should decide, the conservatives should decide, and in the Baby Doe cases, they said, no, the parents should not decide. We want an absolute rule. So it's fascinating how things get flipped back. And I think those cases forced Koop to reconcile these conflicting aspects. The Department of Health and Human Services actually promulgated a rule saying that basic nutrition, hydration, and appropriate medical treatment needed to be given to children born with congenital anomalies, and the quality of life argument that the physicians were making was irrelevant. That got struck down by the courts. Koop himself came up with a set of rules which included an ethics committee. That got struck down. And eventually there was enacted the latest Baby Doe amendment, where the legislature said that even children who are disabled, who are born with congenital anomalies, are entitled, notwithstanding what their parents say, to have the basic necessities of health. And to me, I think those cases stiffened or else integrated or sharpened the humanity, the integrity, the morality, and the sense of identity. He knew who he was, and maybe that knowing who you are comes out in a surgeon's life, Chuck?
I think, I think that all of those things that you're saying are true. I think one of the difficulties is that the law always tries to make us a clear division, a black and white line. And medicine, especially the kind of pediatric surgical care that Dr. Koop was delivering, has very few clearly defined lines. And that because of that, he was used to living in a world of some uncertainty and holding two contrary concepts in his mind at the same time, making peace with them, finding a middle path.
And apparently able to articulate it in such a way, with such confidence and such passion, that he was able to influence people. In other words, he wasn't coming across wishy-washy or egotistical. It wasn't for his ego that his decisions were made. You never got the sense that it was his ego involved until the end of his life, maybe. You never got that sense. You got the sense that he really, really, really cared about the patients. And maybe that training as a pediatrician, which came out initially, he was called in his hearings, in his confirmation hearings, Dr. Unqualified in some of the cases because he didn't have public health training. But maybe being an expert in dealing with life and death on a daily basis is actually the training that's necessary. What do you think, guys?
What I really love about these stories, and I'm just getting familiar with Dr. Koop's expertise and his experience in his many positions, but this struck me. This quote that you have well, this is you. I'm quoting you here, but you're talking about how he came down as sort of the umpire in the political debate over the AIDS crisis, and best I understand from my limited experience reading about this in the 80s and reading what you've written here, Barbara, you had the conservatives on one hand who seemed to want to stress that this was a disease brought on by sinful behavior, right? This is for these heathens over here who refuse to acknowledge the will of God. And then on the other side, you have, I guess, what we might call progressives today who wanted to stress that this was no fault of the individual and how dare you judge. And it seems that Koop came down right in the middle. So this is the quote. You say, liberals were upset that he emphasized the sexual nature of transmission and for advocating abstinence as the safest means of prevention. Conservatives aligned with President Reagan at the time, the president's belief in the immoral cause of the disease, were shocked at the explicit language and Koop's recommendation to use condoms and provide sex education for children. So I guess the thing that struck me about that is however you feel about those issues and whichever side you come down on, it's good to have public health officials who will come out and say, look, this is my opinion, but this is what the evidence says. And you're both wrong for different reasons. And so here's the information you need to make a sensible decision. I really appreciate that. And it doesn't have to be because I agree with everything that he said there or that I disagree with everything. I get the perception that he's trying to give me good information on which I can make an informed decision as a voter or a policymaker. Can you elaborate on that? What do you think?
Well, I think that he was totally focused in his decision making, in his public role, on the science. So it didn't make a difference to him whether the disease was caused by morality or lack of morality, which, by the way, is not unique in this case. In the cholera epidemics of the 1800s, it was very prevalent for most people to think that cholera was brought on by intemperate behavior and whoring. And this was the cause of diseases weren't known, by the germ theory of disease wasn't known. And it was believed then that cholera was caused by immoral acts. So we hadn't progressed from the mid-1800s to the end of the 1900s. We hadn't progressed too far that morality or sin is the cause of all human harm. And whatever Koop's personal views were, he had holistically blended them together to let science be the arbiter and the individual person or the life of the person going to make the decision. So I think in one of his cases, he said, we're treating the people, the disease is the adversary, not the people. We've got to treat the disease and save the people. And people were focusing on, well, let's blame it on this and let's blame it on, and who cares what we should blame it on? Let's treat the problem. Let's solve the problem. And it doesn't make a difference to the incipient crisis that we're facing, what the cause is. What's your sense, Chuck?
I think there's another interesting piece that Cameron brought into it. I think first that Koop was grounded in both a judgment and that hands-on part. So he had a foot in the world of trying to make a judgment, and the other foot was firmly rested in carrying out an action. We are doers. Surgeons are doers. So that in the end, it wasn't simply a public health statement. It was backed up by actions. And I think that the thing that just hit me listening to Cameron was the fact that perhaps Koop's experience in getting informed consent from parents also played a significant role in how he developed informed consent in the public domain around topics like tobacco. That to get an informed consent, you have to list the risks and the benefits, and you have to do it in such a way that you communicate well with, in this case, the parents. And I think that those kind of communication skills gave him a unique skill set to apply in the public health sphere.
And maybe all of these aspects that we're mentioning is what's missing in our public health leaders today, while luckily for us, Koop embodied all of them.
I wouldn't argue that one. At all.
So the big takeaway from everything we've discussed so far that I take away from this gentleman, and I agree, I think he's impressive just in his willingness to, move forward with the truth as far as he understood it. I don't get the sense that he was backing away from his convictions, so people, like when he came out very strongly against abortion early in his career, the conservatives loved him. But then when I don't know if he moderated his position, but he just said, look, I looked at all the peer-reviewed literature and the claim you're making isn't backed up by the evidence.
Well, okay,
so I don't even know.
I'll address that. He was asked that question, and his spokesperson said that when he came out against abortion, it was his personal view. And he had seen women who had negative psychological reactions. But when he was called on to make a decision as the chief public health officer in the country, his personal view was irrelevant. And he sat and he reviewed all of the studies, like 250 or 300 studies. And he said, there is no science that supports that abortion is dangerous or that it causes psychological harm. And what I found astounding by that is I think it was in one of the cases, the abortion cases that predated Dobbs, it might have been Casey, one of the conservative judges said, oh, by the way, abortion causes psychological harm. And the proponents of choice didn't know to bring in Koop saying, wait a minute, I made a decision that there's no evidence that shows that. So he went to the science, and as public health officer, it was the health of the patient, the health of the public that governed as the science would tell him. His own personal views, these were his own personal views, and he could keep it separate while at the same time not fragmenting. It was fascinating how these two parts of his personality he was able to be true to at the same time, integrate them, and be a holistically integrated person. Absolutely fascinating.
Well, what I like, and what the point I was getting at, and you helpfully built on that just now, Barbara, is that I don't think he had to back away from any of his personal convictions. He was just nuanced and sensible in how he approached these issues. Yeah. And one thing that drives me bananas, and I know we've had some discussions about vaccine mandates, for example, in the past, and one of the points that you've made is that people who oppose mandates, they will just go down the deepest, darkest, absurd rabbit hole into a conspiracy theory. And Pfizer developed these vaccines because they're trying to kill people, or what, like the most absurd things. And my position on all of these different issues is like, look, you can be critical of a vaccine mandate, or you can be critical of abortion, or any of these really controversial ethical issues, but you don't have to be insane about it. You don't have to follow threads that are just obviously false. And I think he illustrated that very nicely. He had very strong convictions to the point that everybody hated him at one point or another in his career. But he was willing to make a thoughtful case, regardless of what he was talking about. And I think you're right. That's what's missing today. It's like, if you are on Team Red, then you have to say these things. And if you're on Team Blue, you have to say these things regardless of whether or not they're true or false. And it drives me nuts. So anything to say on that?
Well, I think you included a critical word. He was nuanced. He could see the nuances. And it's something Chuck also said, you're dealing with individual patients, life and death. Every patient is different. And maybe that experience helped him to be able to see the nuances. And right now we have Team Red and Team Blue, and you're not going to convince them, and they will look for conspiracies to our detriment, because it doesn't make a difference whether there was a conspiracy or not. We've got a problem now. How are we going to solve the problem? So I think you made a very good point there, Cameron, both by the language and the point that that's what we need today, and that's what's missing.
Now, you do mention in the conclusion of the second story, and by the way, I should mention the titles of these. The first one's called Icons of Public Health Leadership, the story of C. Everett Koop. And then the second one is Even the Mighty Fall, the continued story of C. Everett Koop. So these are both at acsh.org. And I want to talk about the conclusion of the second one, because you're talking about, he seems to have fallen into the temptation to make claims because there was some sort of financial incentive involved. Can you talk about that and what you think may have happened?
Well, it's interesting. The superficial reports say that he was working for the company that made the latex. And if you delve into it, he wasn't really. The company, the part that retained him was not making latex gloves. So the optics were bad, and he probably shouldn't have done it. As to why he got involved, who knows? I cited a story of a high priest who at the age of 80 got corrupted. So go show we always have to be mindful. My question to me was, okay, so he got hired by a company. He was so good at seeing the science. What made him not see that latex was not dangerous? Now, it could be, and here it could be that his training didn't allow him to see it. And here, like, for example, comparing him to Frances Kelsey, where she was able to see the trends, the statistics, the epidemiology, but maybe Koop's expertise was in doing and in acting and not in assessing statistics and epidemiology. And maybe he did get carried away and he didn't see the danger. And that to me was his flaw. Not the optics are bad, not that he was hired by a subdivision of a different company, but that he missed an obvious, he committed a type B error. Was it a type A error? I don't remember. He missed an obvious causation problem there. And maybe that's where his training, he didn't have the training to do the job. And rather than seeing that he was so used to being the man on the totem pole that he just ventured an opinion without having the requisite degree of knowledge. And
there's one. First of all, academicians are not usually very good business people, and just as is the case now, that's changing over time because there's a lot of paperwork involved in grants and other things, but that's often left to some administrative type to deal with. And so I think that that's part of what played into this. And I think there also may be a little bit that the people that were interested in having Dr. Koop work for them were more interested in his eminence than his particular expertise. And that, like a lot of scientists and physicians as we get older, eminence unfortunately opens doors that we should have better left shut. I mean, you think about Linus Pauling and vitamin C, or there's any number of places. So I think that that's part and parcel of what we're seeing here. Sometimes you have to walk away from the spotlight.
Yeah, it's not actually, it's in all walks in life. People stay on too long. My husband talks about politicians who keep running when they should have retired if it's past their sell-by date.
Well, it's true. I mean, you look at the current leadership in Congress. And these are people of my generation. It's time for the boomers to get off the stage and leave it to the people that are going to be around.
It's so funny to hear you all say that. I remember I was watching a documentary about the Waco massacre over the weekend, and there were people in the congressional hearings that are still there today, and they were old in 1994. And they're still here. They're still saying the same things. Nothing's changed. It's incredible. But this is the quote. This is another quote I want to include. Barbara, you include this. I'm not sure who said this, but it's someone talking about Dr. Koop. So they say, persons of integrity remain true to their vision, no matter where they are or who they happen to be with, scrupulously avoiding the chameleonism of those who seem to change their beliefs to fit in, please others, and advance their own interests. One inspirational example of such integrity was C. Everett Koop. I love that quote so much because I think everybody to some degree today fails to live up to that standard, or at least they really feel the pressure to conform what they say to whatever is politically expedient or whatever is going to allow them to avoid controversy at work, right? I'm just trying to pay the mortgage. I'm going to keep my mouth shut. And it doesn't seem that he was willing to do that. Maybe I'm repeating myself. I just love that. It's just so courageous.
Yeah, and I think that was the tool that enabled him to be successful. He was the paragon of integrity, and he could rationalize, he could reconcile even the conflict or the seemingly conflicting aspects, the religious aspect and the science aspect. He knew who he was. There is a right and there was a wrong, and the right and the wrong might have varied depending on the circumstances, but he had the facility to move with the circumstances and not be stuck. And maybe that's what, when we talk about these old timers, maybe it's not a matter of age, although age generally does result in being stuck in one's approaches, one's beliefs, one's habits, but the ability to shift mentally, even looking at something from a different perspective. How does the parent feel about this? How does the public feel about this? I know how I feel about this, but that's not relevant. And I think that integrity was probably the most important of his characteristics that enabled him to achieve what he was able to. I agree, Cameron. I think that's right.
Excellent stuff. Well, everyone go read these articles. Again, they're called Icons of Public Health Leadership, the story of C. Everett Koop. And the follow-up is Even the Mighty Might Fall, the continued story of C. Everett Koop. And of course, our guest today has been Dr. Barbara Billauer, legal scholar, I don't know if you call yourself a bioethicist, but...
No, I do not call myself a bioethicist. No way.
Okay. Someone with relevant expertise who discusses bioethics.
Yes,
okay.
that would be more accurate to say.
Okay, awesome. Well, both of these articles are on our homepage, and if you just Google Barbara's name and ACSH, you'll find all the material she's written, and you can find all her academic work as well. Follow us as well as an organization. It's just acsh.org. And if you want to get the stories we talk about on this show, you go to the website, go to the subscribe tab at the top, punch in your email address. 3 times a week, we'll send you the stories we publish. And then we come to the show and we talk about them. So if you read the stories, you're going to know what we're talking about on this podcast. We're also on Twitter at ACSH.org. And Chuck's on Twitter, but he doesn't really use it. And I don't use Twitter because I can't stand it. So, so you're stuck following the organization. Thank you all so much, as always, for listening. And we will see you in the new year for episode 32.